Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to today's webinar on cross-border controls. My name is Daniela Jukic, and I'll be your moderator. And today's webinar is sponsored by our Platinum partner, BP. So allow me to introduce today's speakers. We are being presented by Brett Barton, but we're also being joined by Richard Calver and David Johns. From the beginning of the pandemic, border-related closures has been changing very quickly. So NatRoad has provided the most accurate and timely information for cross-border controls. Due to the number of changes and the rise of COVID-19 in Victoria and New South Wales, it is important to keep up to date with this. So before I hand over my mic to Brett and to begin this presentation, I'd like to go through a few housekeeping items. I request that you all put your microphone on mute so that we can avoid any disturbance during the webinar. However, we'd love to hear from you at the end of the presentation. If you do have any questions for our speakers, please do feel free to type in your questions into the question pane of the control panel. You can send these questions in during any time, and we'll be answering them at the end of the session. So without further ado, let me hand over to Brett, who'll go through state by state what the border controls are.
Good afternoon, NatRoaders, and thank you, Daniela. Welcome to our roundup of the border controls in Australia as they exist today. They could be different later today or tomorrow, but that's part of the message we have, is that it's pretty important to keep up to date. So as far as today is concerned, we'll just have a bit of a housekeeping note to begin with. Then we'll look at the power that enables border controls to be put in place. Look at what controls exist around the countryside, state and territory wide, examine the idea of what's a close contact, because that's quite relevant for some people when they're entering some jurisdictions around the countryside. Look at some of the issues that we've experienced over the last few months as borders have been controlled to varying degrees, and those controls have changed. Of course, there's the very much behind the entire presentation is the notion that we need to have proper COVID-19 safe workplaces, and then we can look at some of the resources that are available to you, and also end up with a question and answer session where Richard and David will help provide responses there. Just a note at the end there, this is not considered legal advice. It's information that we believe to be accurate at the moment. If you have particular circumstances, feel free to contact any three of us after the presentation, and we're happy to go through your particular issues and provide advice. And as I said earlier, things can change at any time, so this is the best information we have at the moment, but it's important to keep up to date as time goes by. So we anticipate that the presentation should take about 30 minutes. And we've allowed for at least 10 minutes of Q&A time at the end. A copy of the presentation and a sound file, will be available for participants as well, and others who haven't had the opportunity to listen to it today. So that'll be available on the NatRoad website in the very near future. So to start with, I just want to talk briefly about the power that enables the border controls to be put in place. So basically the legislative framework is that the federal government and each state and territory government has particular laws in place that allow them to respond to health and other emergencies. Every single state and territory have used these laws to varying degrees to respond to the COVID-19 pandemic. So when an emergency is declared, the process is that a particular position is nominated to be the person responsible for the emergency response, basically. In most states and territories, this person is the Chief Health Officer. However, in a couple of states, like South Australia and WA, for example, the top police officer is nominated as the emergency controller, basically. So these positions, under the laws that have been activated, they're given extremely wide powers, and they can do things under those laws that wouldn't normally be acceptable. like telling people to stay at home or who they can associate with, or the amount of distance you're meant to have between people, and in this case, basically the borders, who can cross borders, and any conditions that are placed on people if they're allowed into a state or a territory. Now, there's been a lot of misinformation over the last few months about border controls, a lot of rumours. Sometimes the official information isn't even all that clear. So if you have any doubts, please read the official order or health direction, and that should help clarify what the situation should be. So it's also important to note, and you've no doubt all seen it on the media, that the laws that are used, they come with penalties attached, whether it's a fine or in some cases imprisonment. So they're serious bits of legislation, they're serious powers, and it really pays to know what they are and how to comply. So on that note, you can find the health directions for every state and territory. The links are provided in the presentation. I won't go through each one at the moment. You feel free to visit those at your leisure. But all of those public health orders, the public health directions or the emergency declarations, they're all public, and they're updated from time to time. So feel free to visit those. And of course, we've heard for several months now that we're all in this together. Every state and territory, with the exception of Victoria, currently has some form of border control in place. Conveniently, all of these controls are different. There are different requirements for each jurisdiction, and there are different processes in place for doing things like applying for a pass to get into a state or a territory. So it's important to not make an assumption that just because you know what's happening in WA, that the same will happen in Queensland, because it just doesn't work that way. In every jurisdiction, most jurisdictions provide some level of exemption for road transport and logistics, but not all and not always. So again, it's pretty important to understand the leeway provided to our industry in crossing different borders. And as I've mentioned previously, changes can occur quite quickly. Usually there is little notice. Sometimes there is not a lot of detail attached to announcements. So it's important to keep up to date, but it can also be difficult to keep up to date as well. But NatRoad updates its coronavirus webpage, including the border controls that are in place. We update that whenever any change occurs. So that's one place to look, and likewise, every state and territory publishes its border controls as well. So, and if you can hear the fire alarm in the background, there's nothing to worry about, it's just a test. Now, if we start going around the countryside, as far as border controls are in place, the federal government hasn't really used its biosecurity powers to control traffic across different state and territory borders. They have put in place some controls that limit access to some remote Indigenous communities. However, as far as state and territory borders are concerned, it all comes down to state and territory legislation and the laws and local authorities as to how those borders are restricted. So if we start off with NatRoad's hometown of Canberra, basically the only control that we have in place is for people who've been to Victoria in the 14 days before they try and enter the ACT. So no other restrictions occur, and if you're coming in from New South Wales or Queensland or anywhere else, provided you haven't been to Victoria in the previous 14 days, there is no problem. For ACT residents that are coming back having been to Victoria within the last 14 days, they need to advise ACT Health but before they come back into the territory, and they can be required to self-isolate on return. Non-residents who have been to Victoria in the prior 14 days aren't meant to come in unless they have an exemption, and there are only pretty limited grounds for exemptions. However, the public health order that's been declared does have an exception in there for road transport that's transiting the ACT for freight delivery and collection, and also for rest breaks. So you don't need an exemption if you fall into this category. However, the ACT Health have published some protocols that they want to apply to people using the transit permission under the health order. So that's limiting rest breaks to no more than one night, taking reasonable steps to limit contact with others, sticking to the vehicle or your accommodation when you're not actually working, having your food delivered and using contactless purchasing, and keeping records of the places you visit in the ACT, including dates and times. Now, those protocols, they're not actually in the health order, so they're something that's been imposed since the health order was declared. And if drivers need to stay more than one night, they'll need to apply for an exemption. So the exemption can be applied for online, and we'll look at where to find that later on. As far as New South Wales is concerned, there are no restrictions apart from the ones applying to Victoria. So if a person has visited Victoria in the 14 days before trying to enter New South Wales, there's a couple of different situations. One is if you're a New South Wales resident, you have to quarantine for 14 days on return. And if you're a non-resident, you're not meant to go into New South Wales unless you're an authorised person or have a border entry pass. Now, an authorised person includes somebody providing a critical service, and moving freight and persons on a commercial basis is deemed to be a critical service. So our industry has an exemption in place. If you've been to Victoria in 14 days before entering New South Wales, performing a freight task, then you can get a critical service border pass to go into New South Wales. Now, border passes are issued with conditions, and for those that are in road freight, one of the conditions that your permit will say, or your pass will say, is that you're not required to self-isolate if your employer has a COVID-19 safety plan. So that's pretty important. When the pass system was first introduced, there was a bit of a complication, and passes were being issued with a requirement that people had to isolate for 14 days after they entered New South Wales. That's been clarified and changed, and the pass is now issued with the statement that you're not required to self-isolate if you have a COVID-19 safety plan in place. Now, there's no prescribed COVID-19 safety plan. However, the New South Wales government provides a template on one of its websites, and we'll show you where to find that. And also it has a voluntary registration process for these safety plans, so that you can go on and basically declare that you've got a safety plan in place and you'll follow it. And the registration enables you to access a whole bunch of other materials like posters and signs that say you are a COVID-19 safe workplace. So you could put those up in your depots and in your trucks, and it's a bit of advertising to the world that you're doing the right thing. NatRoad also has a template that satisfies the New South Wales requirements for a safety plan. So you can find that on the NatRoad coronavirus webpage. And again, if you choose, you could register with the New South Wales government saying that you have a safety plan in place. Getting back to that complication about when passes were initially issued for New South Wales, if you have a pass that was given to you before the 9th of July, basically you should replace that as soon as possible. Even though New South Wales authorities have said that for road transport, the condition that was originally attached to those early passes that people had to self-isolate, they've said that that won't be enforced. There are still some people on the front line, some police officers and authorised officers that didn't get that memo. So to avoid any potential complications, it's best that if you have one of those early passes, just replace it with a current one. Now, there are about 54 border crossings between New South Wales and Victoria. People who go across will know the 6 main ones intimately. A whole bunch of minor ones have been closed, and not only are there personnel stationed at all of the open crossings, both police, health officers, Australian Defence Force personnel, for some of the areas that are closed and for some of the gaps in between the border crossings, there are also patrols as well, including aerial surveillance. So New South Wales authorities are pretty keen to keep people out unless they've got a valid pass to come into New South Wales. So those passes last for 14 days. So you don't have to get one for each and every trip, but yeah, it's important to make sure that your pass is current when you enter New South Wales. You don't want to be turned away. As for the Northern Territory, if we look at from tomorrow, I won't deal with the rest of today because there's not a lot left, but from tomorrow the situation changes a bit. Basically, the only restriction that will be in place applies to those people that have been to a COVID-19 hotspot. So all non-excluded travellers, so that's everybody that hasn't been to a COVID-19 hotspot, they can enter the Northern Territory, but they have to complete an online pre-arrival border crossing application. So that's pretty important. The NT borders are a long way from anywhere, so you'd want to get that sorted before you turn up. However, for those that have been to a designated COVID-19 hotspot, it's a bit of a problem. If you've been to a hotspot within 14 days of trying to get to the NT, you'll be put into mandatory quarantine in government-provided accommodation, which I believe is down at Howard Springs in what used to be a construction camp, and you'll be given the bill for that, which I think is about $2,500 at the moment. Currently, there are no exemptions available for anybody who has been to a COVID-19 hotspot within 14 days of wanting to go to the NT. That includes road transport and logistics, so that's a bit of an issue. Now, as far as what the NT calls a hotspot, that's currently all of Victoria and Greater Sydney. So the Greater Metropolitan Area for Sydney are currently declared COVID-19 hotspots, and there's a little bit of a detailed note at the bottom of the screen there that you can see that, you know, if you're able to actually ride through all of Victoria without dismounting your bike and get into New South Wales and travel to the NT, then you're not deemed to have been to a hotspot. So it's a fairly tight definition of a hotspot and very limited exception for people transiting through a hotspot that would still be able to go into the Northern Territory without problem. However, I just make the note again that everybody going into the NT that's allowed to go still has to fill out a pre-arrival border crossing application. And there's a new form that's available for those entering from tomorrow onwards. At one point, though, the NT government was saying that that would only apply till the end of the month, but I don't think they're saying that anymore. So that application process could be in place for quite a while to come. As for Queensland, this is a popular topic over the last few weeks. So as of now, anyone entering Queensland needs a border declaration pass. That includes people within our industry. Passes last at most 7 days. However, if your details change before the 7 days are up, then you need to get a new pass. Restrictions apply to people that have been to a designated COVID-19 hotspot. This is a theme. So that applies for if you've been to Victoria and the two hotspots in Sydney, Campbelltown City and Liverpool City within the 14 days of entering Queensland. So if you've been to a hotspot, you can't enter Queensland unless you're exempt. Road transport, freight and logistics is deemed to be exempt as an essential activity. As I say, all of Victoria is a hotspot as far as Queensland is concerned, as is Campbelltown City and Liverpool City in Sydney. So one of the conditions of entry for somebody entering Queensland who has been to a hotspot and is allowed in is basically you have to keep a record of close contacts while you're in Queensland for the 14 days after entry. So that if you're in there for less than 14 days, that's fine. It's only for the period that you're in Queensland. If you're in there for more than 14 days, you only have to keep that record for 14 days. And whilst you're within Queensland, of course, minimise your contact with other people. As far as South Australia is concerned, basically Everyone going to South Australia has to apply for pre-approval for entry. That includes people within transport and freight. You should make those applications online at least 72 hours in advance. And this is a fairly important note. There needs to be support from relevant evidence when you're making that application. So, for example, for an employee driver, a letter on company letterhead saying that the person is employed by your company, they are on a legitimate freight task, what the nature of the freight task is. That should be provided as part of your evidence for the border pass for South Australia, and the employee should carry that with them when they're going into South Australia. We've had members who have had online applications refused because they haven't provided that sort of evidence, and drivers turned away at the border because they weren't carrying that sort of evidence. Having said that, people can have inconsistent experiences that they're fine to go in one day and not the next, even though if they haven't had that sort of evidence with them on both occasions. So it's best to do that. There is a note on the SA Police website where you apply for entry that does tell you about the evidence, but it's not exactly all that obvious. So travellers from Tasmania, the Northern Territory, WA and Queensland, they still need to fill out the online pre-approval for entry, but they can enter into South Australia without having to worry about quarantine. Travellers from the ACT and New South Wales still can enter South Australia, but they do have to worry about being quarantined for 14 days unless they're an essential traveller. And Victorian residents can't enter South Australia at the moment unless they're an essential traveller. So an essential traveller includes those in commercial transport and freight. So transport and freight travellers basically need to keep a record of close contacts while they're in South Australia. And there's a set form for that South Australian authorities have kindly provided. And the Victorian transport and freight travellers, they also have to wear a mask while they're in public and minimise their contact with people that they come into association with whilst they're in South Australia. So that's an important note for Victorian residents who are essential travellers who are in the transport and freight business, to make sure that they're equipped with appropriate masks when they go to South Australia. So South Australia has designated, I think it's about 21 or 22 roads from across the Victorian border that you have to use to enter South Australia. Other roads are blocked and you get into trouble if you don't use the designated roads. If you're a member of a border community on the Victorian side, you're allowed into South Australia, but you can't stray more than 50 kilometres. And there's a map on the South Australian website that shows you where that 50-kilometre mark is. It's just sort of this strange rectangle hanging off the Victoria border on the South Australian side. So that's South Australia. And we have Tasmania, and you'll notice that the pictures have changed a little bit for Tasmania. Given that's my home state, I thought I'd give the tourism industry there a plug in the event that you're allowed to visit anytime in the near future. So travellers from all states and territories except Victoria have to quarantine for 14 days when they go to Tasmania unless they're an essential traveller. If you've been in Victoria, you can't enter unless you're an essential traveller, or that you've transited directly through Victoria to the Port of Melbourne or to Tullamarine Airport. So that's an exception, and their transit rules are a little more sensible than the Northern Territory ones. You're actually allowed out of the vehicle to do things like fuel up. So for transport, freight and logistics, our industry is classified as an essential traveller, so you're still permitted to go into Tasmania. There's no issue with that, although there are going to be constraints on what you can do when you're in Tasmania. And this isn't an example of a Tasmanian home-built truck, by the way. This is at the Museum of Old and New Art in Hobart. It's one of the sculptures there, sort of a tribute to the industry. So for essential travellers, you need to register your entry into Tasmania beforehand. You can do it when you get there, but you run the risk that you're going to be held up by the biosecurity officers at Devonport, which is where most people come into Tasmania for road transport. They have a new system in place. It used to be a sort of an email or form through, but as of today, they're using the G2G website, which is the same one that WA has in place. So that's a bit of progress. So basically, you can go on to the website or use the G2G app, fill out your application. It'll be considered, and if you're approved, you'll be given a QR code that you can use to show when you enter Tasmania, and that'll be your evidence that you've been given permission to come in. When you're in Tasmania, if you're an essential traveller and you've been to Victoria, you'll have to wear a mask in public. So again, like South Australia, you also need to basically confine yourself to your accommodation in Tasmania, whether it's the truck or a motel or wherever. You're allowed out for essential purposes, for example, getting food, but basically if you're not working or out for an essential purpose, you're meant to confine yourself to quarters, unless working, of course, too. So that's Tasmania. Tasmania was due to look at easing its restrictions for entry from other parts of the country later this month, but they're not going to do that anymore until the current situation with outbreaks is concerned. And as for Victoria, which, as we've heard, a couple of places have basically said the whole of the state is a hotspot. As far as Victoria is concerned, though, it has no controls on its borders with anybody. So if you want to go to Victoria, anyone from anywhere can go in. It's only when you want to leave that you need to worry about controls. However, once you're in Victoria, there is a situation, of course, if you've been following the news for the last couple of weeks, where there are outbreaks of COVID-19 within Melbourne. So the state government has basically declared all of metropolitan area, Melbourne, and the Shire of Mitchell, which is just north of Melbourne, to be under stage 3 stay-at-home orders. So basically, if you're within those areas, there are only 4 reasons why you can leave home, and if you're outside of those areas, there's only 3 reasons why you can go into those stay-at-home areas. So one of the reasons for travel within the metropolitan area and the Shire of Mitchell and into those areas from other parts of Victoria is basically that you can go into work, or you can travel within the hot zones to work. If the work can't be performed at home, obviously road transport can't be performed at home, so it's permitted. So that's not a problem. However, we'd suggest that you always carry some form of evidence to show that you need to be in those areas that have been declared a hot zone, and that you're going about a legitimate freight task. And of course, adopt COVID-19 safe work practices whilst you're travelling in those areas in particular. So that's Victoria, and to state the obvious, the situation in Victoria in particular has been the impetus for other places like Queensland, like Northern Territory, like South Australia, like Western Australia, like Tasmania, to put in place special arrangements for people who've been to Victoria. And those have been extended in some cases to hotspots in Sydney as well. So if we visit our cousins in the West, basically you can't get into WA unless you have an exemption. Nobody that's been in Victoria in the 14 days prior to wanting to go to WA can get in unless you have an exemption. There are 2 different exempt lists. However, conveniently, transport and freight workers are exempt in both cases, so that's not an issue. However, you do have to get approval before you get into WA, and you use their G2G website or app, again, to apply through that online or app process, and they'll issue, if you're approved, you'll get a QR code that you can display in your vehicle or on your phone as you cross the border. If you don't want to use the online process, you can still apply by email, by filling out a form and emailing a form in. However, there's a warning from the WA authorities that will take an awful lot longer than if you use the online process. So when you're making the application, you'll likely need to provide evidence of your status as transport and freight and what task is being performed, where you're going, what you're carrying, all that sort of thing. So carry those evidentiary documents with you when you cross the border as well. So that's pretty much WA. WA did have restrictions on travel within the state as well, but they've pretty much all been set to one side, apart from some remote Indigenous communities. So this notion of what's a close contact, you will have noticed that as we've gone through, you know, the likes of Queensland, the ACT, South Australia, that if you're allowed in, that you need to keep a record of a close contact whilst you're within those jurisdictions for the 14 days, for up to 14 days if you're there for that long. So thankfully there is a universal definition of what's a close contact. Basically it comes down to somebody that you share a confined space for 2 hours or more, or somebody that you're closer than 1.5 meters for 15 minutes or more. So that's the definition of a close contact. Basically, the close contact, the content really changes a little bit from place to place. However, if you're keeping the name of the person you have contact with, their phone number, their email address, where you contacted them, the date and the time, where any and all of that is possible, then you should be satisfying the requirement to maintain a close contact record. You need to hang on to those records for at least 28 days. South Australia does have a form that's available on their website to use. Other states don't. NatRoad has developed a form that you can actually use. It's available on our website too. So, and if you obviously if you're travelling in South Australia, ACT and Queensland, you're probably going to have drivers that are going to be pretty much maintaining a continuous record of close contacts. So keep in mind, close contact isn't just anybody that you bump into. So if you go into a service station and pay for fuel, you're unlikely to be next to the cashier for 15 minutes or more. So you don't need to, you know, make them your new best friend. If, however, you stop and have a chat to somebody at a depot, or you're sitting in a tea room with people, then for a couple of hours while you're waiting for a truck to be loaded, then you will need to include that in the close contact record. So again, those records can be demanded by the authorities in each of the jurisdictions where you're obliged to keep them. So as far as testing is concerned, this was a bit topical of late. So I haven't gone into it in a lot of detail, but if you go to places like South Australia and WA, if you're there for more than a few days, then you might be required to undertake a COVID-19 test. So if you do have drivers or you're traveling yourself into an interstate and you're going to be, you know, present in that state or that territory for longer than a week, it would pay to check the testing requirements before you enter. You might be obliged to undertake one or more COVID-19 tests whilst you're in that location. There is some discussion that negative COVID-19 tests results might be required for actually going into some states. That hasn't been a requirement as yet, but it's possible that some places will decide to do that at some point. So we believe it's wise for people to actually consider and plan for that contingency to make sure that you're ready and that you know what you're going to do if those requirements are put in place. Like, you know, make sure your drivers know that it might be a requirement, know where your local testing facilities are, maybe talk to the local testing authorities and just suss out exactly what the situation would be if you need to test for occupational reasons, rather than because somebody has been in close contact with somebody who has the virus, or because they think that they're exhibiting symptoms and want to get tested. So it's a different reason for testing, and you're better off planning that stricter testing requirements might come into place for transport folk in the not too distant future. If it doesn't happen, that's great, but there's a chance that it will. Some of the issues that we've seen come up over the last few months since border controls have been put in place. This isn't an exhaustive list by a long shot, The needs of road transport and logistics haven't always been taken into account before restrictions have been put in place. Often we've found announcements being made quite suddenly and with little detail attached to them. It's not uncommon. Sometimes the announcements don't come out in a consistent manner. Sometimes they might be announced on their websites that have been set up to publicise border control information. Other times, it's been a tweet. Other times it's been a police Facebook page. Sometimes it's just been rumour. So it makes it difficult from time to time to keep up to date with what the requirements are and what the detail is. Often details have needed clarification, and we've had to do that quite a few times and sought clarification from the relevant state authorities. Past systems that have been implemented haven't always been available at the same time as controls coming into place, or they haven't worked properly, and you've probably experienced that yourselves. Frontline enforcement doesn't always know what's going on. They don't always get the memos about what the relevant rules are at any particular point in time. So that has been an issue for some members who've been denied entry or given a hard time when they tried to cross a border. And of course, the big one is that every state and jurisdiction has different rules and different systems. I'll give credit to Tasmania that they've gone down the path of using the WA G2G system for getting a pass, so that's a bonus. So at least they're not doing something different again. So, and no doubt you're able to add plenty of other issues or problems that you've encountered with border controls over the last few months too. And I don't expect that it's going to get any easier or any clearer as time goes on. Not until all of the controls are eliminated, and that won't be happening anytime soon. So obviously, if you don't have a COVID-safe workplace policy or plan at the moment, you should. In some jurisdictions, it's actually required. In New South Wales, for example, if you don't want to isolate, if you're coming in from Victoria and you don't want to isolate, then you need to have a COVID safe plan that is in place and carry it with you. So all of the different states and territories have some information that's available on what a COVID-safe workplace looks like. Some information is better than others, some is more detailed than others. We also have a bunch of information that's available on our coronavirus webpage as well. And as you can see, here are the links to the relevant web pages for each state and territory, and also the Safe Work Australia website as well, which is picked up by a couple of different jurisdictions as their default guidance for a COVID-safe workplace. So have a look at all of that material. If you have questions, feel free to contact David, Richard, or myself, and we can help you with those requirements. The COVID-safe workplace policy plan that we have on our webpage, really easy to use. And resources, there's a bunch of links that are available there, both for the websites where all of the updates are available for border crossings for the different states and territories, and also where to find the border permits in each of the jurisdictions, of course, with a notable exception of Victoria, which doesn't require any. So that's basically me. If people have questions, then David and Richard are happy to try and answer them.
Thank you so much, Brett, for putting all that information together. It's a very confusing landscape, and it's very important that we all keep up to date with those protocols. We actually haven't had any questions come through. So like you, I just want to remind everyone, you're more than welcome to call our team. We're happy to field questions or email us. So our number is 0262953000, or email through to info@natroad.com.au. And as Brett mentioned, I do want to highlight that we do update the coronavirus webpage pretty much daily as information comes through, as well as our border controls page. So that's also on www.natroad.com.au/coronavirus. So again, everyone, please stay up to date with everything. We all have a part to play in keeping safe. So go out there, do your jobs, and continue doing great things. Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.